Hello and welcome to SHOWstudio's Spring Summer 25 menswear and Autumn Winter 24 Haute Couture roundup. I'm editor Hetty Mahlich.
I'm fashion features editor Joshua Graham.
And we're going to be talking to you about some of the key ideas that came out of this season. Obviously that's a lot of shows that we could talk to you about, but I really want us to talk about this kind of responsibility that designers have. There's an obvious one to it's the business of fashion, the business of selling clothes, the business of running a global luxury business. But there's also this responsibility of a designer who's a creative to respond to culture and to provoke culture through clothing. So Josh and I kind of want to approach some of the shows this season on how and if designers were provoking kind of ideas and conversations through the clothes that they designed and presented. I thought an interesting way to start would be to talk about the idea of artist collaborations, which we saw this season, by starting off with Dior Men's and Kim Jones.
Master of collaboration.
Master of collaboration. I mean, at Dior, he's been there since 2018. You know, he's collaborated with Sean Stussy, with Cause. He pulls on all these different kind of artists, and he's kind of been one of those pioneers who's really made fashion into a collectible object in a different way to kind of how it existed within a cult kind of fashion sphere. He's made it kind of mainstream collectible. You know, I always think about that Louis Vuitton Supreme collection that he did. And we had another artist collaboration this season with the pharmacist Hilton Nell. This is Kim's 60th Dior collection. I think again it was just a masterful show at, you know, you've got his kind of blueprint template of menswear, the tailoring, and then weaving a collaboration into that. I kind of thought that the craft could have been pushed more with this. And I'm just interested in what you think about whether you think the artist collaboration idea, do you still find that interesting and provoking?
I always think it can be. I think there's a lot of space for it to be provoking and interesting. Maybe it's just because of the volume that Kim Jones approaches his artist collaborations that it's hard to find any kind of real meaning or understanding in why this is happening. I think this collection specifically really looked at this idea of like memory and these mementos, these amazing ceramics, and what they mean today, what they're going to mean tomorrow, what they're going to mean years from now, and the kind of emotion that we put into these objects. But I don't know if that necessarily translated in, again, his kind of signature utilitarian silhouettes that seemingly are repeated season after season with a new slant or with a new illustration or with a new print from another creative.
I wonder whether that kind of having that blueprint and applying an artist collaboration each season, I wonder whether that's kind of reflective and speaks to that kind of collectible psychology of how people kind of collect fashion in a way now, and that status of brands like Dior. You know, it's the same thing as kind of an art collector might collect a piece of art, not necessarily because of taste, but because of the status it holds. And it feels like maybe it's indicative of fashion at that level too, that, you know, that kind of idea of it being a limited product because it's this artist collaboration rather than necessarily the values of the artist.
It's almost seasonless, right? It's not by Spring Summer 25, not by Autumn Winter 24. It's by
that
the artist that he's working with that season. It's the Dior Nell collection. It's the Dior Jordans. It's the Dior Sorayama. It's never time, which I think is actually kind of interesting now thinking about it.
Yeah, I agree actually, and I think it's reflective of Kim himself being a collector. Like he's an obsessive collector and he understands the value of an object and making fashion into these objects which have value and meaning in them. I wanted to start with kind of Kim's Dior Men's before we then kind of look at the flip side almost of Maria Grazia's women's wear, specifically her haute couture, because I think this season my problem with this collection was the same that it often is with her artist collaborations, where the collaboration is kind of left to just the show space and it's not actually brought through into the clothes. She worked with Faith Ringgold, the late artist who passed away in April, I kind of did a very focused review on this if you want to go and watch it, kind of breaking this down. But I kind of want to just touch on that to discuss between us kind of that contrast of how Kim does it and then someone like Maria, and whether you think how that value changes when it's in the product and when it's just in this like kind of storytelling sphere, like whether it just feels
performative.
Yeah, performative and not because you're like past that show, that collaboration's not going to live any further. It is in one of the Lady Art Dior bags, but it's not actually in the collection itself.
Yeah, and it's also not kind of being integrated into the lives of the consumers in the way that it is whoever's at the show gets to experience it, versus Kim Jones, who does kind of give you these objects, gives you this fashion to incorporate into your life in whatever way, beyond maybe a printed t-shirt that Maria Grazia is sure to shell out.
Yeah, and I just wonder whether, I mean, it's obviously for a very specific type of consumer, Maria Grazia's Dior, and she's been there such a long time now. Obviously it sells and it does really well, and she knows that consumer, and in a similar way to Kim, it's kind of like she has her silhouettes and her kind of aesthetic she goes back to. Like, there was a lot of Grecian draping this season, which is kind of a Maria Grazia favourite.
The Olympics are coming up.
The Olympics. I was thinking about doing the Olympics as a theme in this roundup, and then I just couldn't quite bear to do it.
No.
I mean, if we're going to quickly touch on it, there was Dior, Tom Brown did it, a few others did, but I don't think it's the most interesting thing that we can talk about, because I think it actually veers on what we're kind of discussing, which is fashion that doesn't have kind of a purpose to it, that's just playing on ideas of kind of theme and story at a kind of surface level.
If it's ideas that I think are lasting, ideas that we can revisit years to come, we can look back on this collection and say, actually, that said something about this moment, rather than, wow, the Olympics were coming up, so we're going to do Grecian dresses.
And I think it's important, like the context of what brand we're talking about as well, because I think, say, Dior Men's, we kind of expect these kind of game-changing collections from Kim, especially because he's done that in the past. So maybe that's why when it feels less exciting, we feel that more, because Kim's kind of paved that way so much. While as with Maria Grazia, it's kind of disappointing but expected, and you kind of feel like actually for that consumer, maybe what she's doing is completely right for that. You don't expect, I don't think that Christian Dior consumer doesn't want clothes that are provocative in terms of psychology, while as
season after season they've proven that, and I think she's proven that. But I think we talk about it all the time. I think we want more for them, and we want them to want more for themselves.
I guess it's like that consumer, right? That there isn't just one type of consumer. There are multiple different types of consumers. I think it's quite interesting to talk about that Dior man or woman and then shift to talking about Prada, where I think you do expect something that is challenging and that perhaps you don't understand at first. I mean, I'm sitting with a Prada fan in your shirt. What were your first thoughts on the collection? Because we haven't had a chance to actually catch up on this one.
I really enjoyed it. I always loved Prada. I love Raf Simons. I'm a huge Raf Simons apologist. I know so many people season after season are like, this is less Miuccia and more Raf every time. I felt this collection was very, a real blend of them both. And I thought it was surprisingly familiar in the way they tackled silhouette. It reminded me really of the kind of mid-2000s and that Prada Sport Neil Barrett men's time, right? Where the trousers were quite loose versus the skin tight, almost like, early aughts silhouette. But then kind of subverted in this, in how they were wrinkled. And we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about sensuality in a bit, but the crop and the midriff is the new kind of erogenous zone.
I think I liked Prada more, and then the more I've thought about it, the less I've liked that collection. Maybe it's it being a menswear collection, and that I've always found the womenswear collection slightly more challenging and interesting. But I didn't find this collection, I wish it was slightly more subversive. And again, I wonder if that's...
I think that's what I mean about the familiarity. Like there's something, like it's almost like we've seen this, right? And I think it's when you kind of dig into the details, like the colors that were picked, the wrinkled effect that Prada's revisiting again for men's, is what kind of makes it feel different. It makes it feel, and
like,
maybe it's those small elements that are what's subversive.
Yeah, I do agree. I think when I went to the Reece and I saw it up close, like the belts on the kind of herringbone trousers with then this kind of imitation of a belt. It's like trompe l'oeil, but it's not just a print. It is actually kind of fabricated, so it's kind of like that faux leather on the belt. So it's this really interesting, like it's got texture and it's got feeling to it. It's not just flat. And I do like those details and I think they're interesting, but I don't know if I find them challenging enough as concepts within the world of Prada. Like I always find Prada quite psychologically challenging, and that's why I quite enjoy it. And I think it's a very personal experience for the wearer compared to kind of Dior is like, you're wearing Dior because it's Dior. And I'm not saying that's not true of Prada, but I do think people that enjoy wearing Prada or enjoy imitating the look of Prada, it's because you're engaging with something kind of deeper to it.
Thinking.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see how this is going to translate into women's come September.
Yeah, because they always kind of pair together.
How that's going to be expanded. And I wanted to ask you what you think of the collaboration between Raf and Prada.
I definitely think it's felt like it's melded together more seamlessly over the last few seasons. Like it's felt less cut and paste bit. Like I felt like at the beginning it was very like, oh, that's a Raf, oh, that's a Prada. Whereas you can feel like their ways of thinking are becoming more collaborative, I think, with the collections.
Do we think that's working? Because like I think those early seasons for me were quite captivating in that tension between two creatives who have very similar aesthetic values and ideas, but also vastly different ways of approaching fashion and creativity. And there was that kind of that clash between two of them that was so apparent in these collections that I found fascinating.
Yeah, I agree, and I wonder whether, I do think they've melded together more, but I also wonder whether now it's getting to the point where it's kind of like one of them shouts louder than the other. Like this season I felt like it was Raf, like, you know, those kind of boiler suits at the end with the neon colours. It felt very kind of like techno, a bit of kind of Antwerp, but also like Berlin and those kind of things that Raf loves.
Like languid man that he like loves so much.
And that's okay, but I just felt like the Raf this season shouted more for me than that kind of tactile awkwardness of Mucha that I really enjoy. So I wonder whether it's getting a bit, I don't know, melded, but also there's a friction where it's one is dominating over the other too much, rather than this kind of what you were saying with this kind of equal balance of different tension of different kind of collages of their ideas together.
Literally fighting each other on the one side, which I find fascinating. But also it's like when we see the women's, I think I've seen the women's as much stronger lately in the last couple of years.
No, definitely.
So to see this kind of translated into that and how it's going to be expanded is going to be really fascinating.
But also just like seeing Prada on the street, like so like those shoes, those court shoes, the bags, the coats, like you see people buying Prada and wearing it.
It's the hottest brand, baby.
Yeah, and I find that really, really interesting, and how they've, you know, like before they did this collaboration, you know, Prada sales weren't great, they were going down, and she'd kind of gradually started to work on those again. And I'd like to see some more figures on how this collaboration is selling, because I do think that I see it more, not just at Fashion Week, but on just like people in the street. And I feel like people are engaging with Prada on a cultural level and a popular level more than I thought they were a few years ago. So I think that's interesting, come back to our point of fashion that engages you. There's that desire from consumers to have something with that layer of intellect, and I think the kind of boom of Loewe is really indicative of that. Like Jonathan Anderson has made things that are weird and subversive and not that definitely aren't about fitting into a mainstream. He's made those interesting. Like people who aren't interested in fashion know who Jonathan Anderson is.
People who aren't interested in craft or certainly want to see like backstage clips about how the puzzle bag is made, how these leathers are treated, and go from the factory to the shop, which Loewe has really pushed in their social media presence in the last year, which I find fantastic.
Their social media is so genius. Like all the videos on how do you pronounce Loewe. I thought this season was really interesting what Jonathan did with his menswear collection. He had collaborations with different artists in the runway space, but the one that I thought was most interesting was having Susan Sontag's book of her essay against interpretation. And that's completely ironic to do because Jonathan's Loewe is all about how the viewer interprets it, and then he's got this seminal essay by Sontag about kind of calling for an erotics of art and kind of the idea that encouraging people to do kind of the opposite to what kind of her job was and also what Jonathan's job is, which is he likes to provoke people and get them interested and to make them kind of interpret things in their own way. I guess that's kind of what this whole conversation we're having is about. But what do you think about this collection in terms of menswear at Loewe, the longevity of it, where it's going? I mean, he's been at Loewe about 10 years now. How kind of culturally relevant do you think this is still, and how long do you think it has left?
How long it has left? God, who knows?
I hope
who
like
knows?
a long time. I don't
yeah.
see it going anywhere.
I think he's really left his mark on the brand, obviously, because he's revamped it in a way that nobody would have thought possible before he was appointed. This collection I thought was quite restrained and refined.
Yeah.
I think the pieces were conceptually still interesting, but not so...
They're not wacky in a fashion way. It's like a restrained concept. I think that idea of restraint is really key because he does these restrained ideas but then presents them to an audience who, like, I just find it so interesting seeing that front row of like random but really relevant actors who might not have engaged with fashion before, and they're seeing these big balloon pants and these kind of belt tops with belts at the bottom which match the belts on the trousers, all these kind of weird avant-garde things, but they're not kind of sitting there going, oh my god, this is so fashion and strange. It's like, okay, that's just Loewe, you know? I think it's really interesting.
I think it's giving people a way to kind of engage with that kind of fashion and that type of fashion. And I think going back to his social media presence and to campaigns and to who he's inviting to the show, because I think there's I think he could go full ham pretentious.
It never feels pretentious.
And it never feels pretentious. He wants pop culture to engage with fashion that's challenging, fashion that isn't what you'll see on the high street. I really love those kind of billowy trousers with that drape connected with the leather Loewe patch. That's almost like, I don't know, this surreal idea of workwear or jeans like Levi's that were wrapped around you and like just like clipped. Yeah. I love that.
I loved the juxtaposition of that with then the feathers that all the models wore.
Those are beautiful.
It made me think of that myth of Icarus that flew too close to the sun. I don't know why that came up for me, and I thought that was kind of an interesting idea. I feel like Jonathan always is leaving those kind of Easter eggs to make you think about where fashion is sitting and where what he's proposing is sitting. I think it would be interesting to now talk about Rick Owens, because I think it's interesting that you said that Loewe never feels pretentious, and it is one of those brands that consumers on a wide scale are engaging with, whether that's on social media or in store, kind of handing over their money and buying these products. Because I think Rick is definitely for a kind of, it's a different sort of audience. It's a more, it's an audience that have to really understand Rick and appreciate what he does, I think. And I think it can come off incorrectly as one of those brands where people see the shows and they think it's very quote unquote fashion.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask what you thought of this show and the kind of the skill of Rick at just always getting the moment right. Like, he always speaks to the feeling of the moment in such a beautiful way.
So this season he returned to the Palais de Tokyo with probably the biggest blockbuster show of the season. It was less catwalk presentation and more, I don't know, like religious procession. All the looks were white, clerical organza drapes on the first ushering of models coming out. Something of that scale and something about the world that Rick builds, I find it really interesting because it aesthetically maybe should be challenging and maybe should be more niche, but he's been so steadfast in what he does for the last few decades that it's connected to people all around the world who I feel like have found this sartorial medium to express a side of them that maybe they didn't feel comfortable to express before. Rick has always been for the weirdos of the world, but he's connected with all of them to the point where I think we're going to look back at Rick's career in the decades to come and be like, wow, that was so vastly different to what was going on in fashion and what was going on in the world, but it resonated.
I think it's interesting to contrast Rick to kind of something like Prada, where it's both these kind of different modes of understanding clothes, but it takes a different, I'm really interested in that kind of psychology of how you engage with clothes and the psychology of what kind of appeals to you about it. And I think, strangely enough, I think Prada's more, can be, definitely the women's wear can be more intimidating in a sense, because I think there's a kind of knowingness to Rick, which is more like, you don't need anyone to know that you're wearing Rick. It's about this kind of private, more humble kind of tribe and spirit, I guess.
Yeah.
And I don't think you fully always need to understand what Rick is saying each season. It's more about just understanding that feeling to it and that spirit to it.
Yeah.
I know that sounds very large dog, but
no, it's like,
you know what I mean?
Because I was thinking about it too, and it's like, in the least derogatory way ever, it's a cult, right? It's the cult of Rick Owens. It's people who are connecting with him as a maker, as a creator, as a cultural figure, and like finding something in what he does and his aesthetic that is tapping into like something within them. Like, this is almost beyond fashion. The clothing is really just a physical manifestation of Rick's values and ideals.
If we're thinking about connecting with someone who's a cultural figure, let's talk about Demna at Balenciaga, because the cult of Demna is definitely a kind of phenomenon of the last few years, whether that was at his brand Vetements, which he then left, and he's now been at Balenciaga. This couture collection really divided people, and it was really about Demna reflecting on his own kind of language of fashion, if you will, kind of his use and upending and his kind of challenging use of streetwear. He's always kind of been very provocative in making us think about where we put value in clothes and kind of hoodies and things like that, and mixing that with the couture language of Balenciaga, whether that be the occasional kind of take on an archive silhouette or mainly with this collection on the kind of treatments and the savoir-faire. What did you think of this collection? You hosted a panel on it for SHOWstudio. What was the key feeling from that panel about this collection?
So when we came into the panel, I wanted a really mixed bag because I knew it was going to be a divisive collection. I wanted people who kind of are in that world of Demna and who understand it from their point of view, but I also wanted people from, like Deborah Milner, who's a fantastic couturier who's worked with McQueen and Sarah Burton, who admittedly doesn't understand or didn't see it as couture the way couture is in her experience, which is a very valid criticism of Demna since he started at Vetements. I enjoyed it. I think that he utilizes the Balenciaga atelier to the best of his ability. He released these BTS clips of the different kind of beading techniques they used to create this dress that looked distressed, that looked like it had been like dragged through the street. But
I love the flannel as well, the embroidery, to make it look like it's just like a jersey flannel, and replacing the kind of old material of gazelle with this nylon crin, with that one-off dress, which he said is only going to has to be draped on the person and he'll produce it one of a kind for whoever orders that or what celebrity.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
He also created the volume of these T-shirts and these hoodies by lining them with what they call black scuba satin, which I think is just a pretentious way of saying neoprene.
I was reading the comments on the panel, and Alb3R701 said, "One can line a T-shirt with gold, it does not elevate it to anything more. Demna's stunts and shock jockey troll fashions have played out for a very long time." No.
Yes. I get it. And I think the point I wanted to come, because we talk about it in the panel, we talk about it with Deborah, I talk about it with Joel, who's a huge Balenciaga fan, that I think we all understand why people have such a visceral reaction, why people get so riled up by seeing this. And a lot of the comments were like, well, you can put as many hours into it, you can do as much craft into it as possible, it's still an ugly T-shirt. And I guess it's like, again, coming back to this idea of fashion that wants to be challenging, Demna asks us to question what fashion is. It's this postmodern Margiela approach that's, can a hoodie and a T-shirt be elevated to the height of fashion? If we collectively decide that this is the height of fashion, why can't it be?
I think in a similar way to what we were speaking about at the beginning with Kim Jones, or even thinking about Pharrell at Vuitton, Demna is one of those people that is very good at and has had such an impact on rewriting and altering the language of kind of fashion and visual culture, and how we engage with kind of fashion and object as these kind of signs to read things in different ways. So I think it's really interesting how divisive this collection has been, but then on the flip side, isn't that also exciting to have people discussing and fighting about it rather than just, letting a kind of Maria Grazia collection wash over you?
Yeah, I think the art of conversation is dead, and that opinion has given way to emotional response. Because if it's not for you, we're not forcing you to engage with it. And I think that's the beauty of what Demna's done in fashion, is we live in such a democratized world because of social media, because of globalization, and Demna's changing aesthetics. Demna's pulling from subcultures that have long been ostracized from luxury, from haute couture, and he's connecting with people on a global basis, people who've probably never felt comfortable or invited to the fashion party. It's a $2 billion brand. It's not. It's working, and I think it goes beyond gimmick.
Going beyond this conversation of kind of that responsibility of a designer, the idea of kind of culture of intellect, these quite big ideas, I wanted to finish by talking a bit about what actually clothes look like this season. What kind of men's silhouette are we seeing come through this season? Because I know you had some kind of key thoughts on this.
Yes, the Paul Mescal effect, I think, is in full effect, because, he's been going viral for his sultry street style, the short rugby shorts and cropped hoodies. And I think we saw a lot of that this season. We saw the cropped midriff look at both Loewe and Prada. We saw Louis Gabriel Nucci, who always does very sensual takes on tailoring, kind of present these mesh tops and these deep V cuts. He also collaborated with an artist, Sasha Faray, a visual artist, on these abstract prints that give these coats and tailoring this very seductive, tactile effect. Of course, there was Magliano and D Squared, who have always kind of explored romantic, sexual, sensual ideas of menswear. Magliano did it with his signature kind of louche tailoring, and they both played with ideas of undoneness, but obviously both very different. D Squared, obviously, these two Canadian twins who love kind of overt sexuality, had these sweat-slicked models wearing leather harnesses and laced up leather hot pants and layering them with mesh shirts. I think it's really fascinating to see menswear kind of veer into this more overtly sexual, sensual idea, because menswear can be quite rigid, and masculinity can also be quite rigid. I saw this as kind of the proliferation or the trickle down of, again, queer aesthetics and how that's providing an outlet for creative sartorial expression. A lot of the looks this season reminded me of Peter Hujar's documentation of Christopher Street in Pre-AIDS.
So interesting because he was obviously a collaborator with Jonathan Anderson this season as well, so that's interesting. Yeah. Where do you think that, because I always think it's quite fascinating how designers will put out collections and you know, it's interesting to have these sit downs and look and stuff, because it's like, wow, all of these designers are thinking about similar lines and themes, and you almost think, did they have this kind of roundtable sit down and discuss, which obviously they didn't. But where do you think, because, you know, fashion is so indicative of culture and society and what's happening, where do you think that kind of desire for that liberation of the body comes from in fashion at the moment?
I think,
do you think that's coming from the same place, or do you think it's just coincidence?
I think it's a real cultural shift, and I think it's a global cultural shift. I think about OnlyFans being a medium for anyone in the world to kind of express themselves sexually, but I also think about the kind of first round of debates. One of the hot topics was on kind of banning pornography, and again, these conservative voices are growing and are all around us and are there and ready to police a lot of the work towards liberal ideals that I think so many queer people have been fighting for the last decades.
I think that's a really poignant way to finish, especially having spoken about that idea of fashion as collectible objects and art which have kind of cultural meaning and value and tell you something about a certain time and place, because I think it brings back that conversation about the importance of clothes and fashion and what it can tell you about the context of a time and what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think this will be a really interesting season to look back on after the kind of within the context of the politics and
what
the
happens
world.
Next. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for watching. Let us know if you have any thoughts or comments below, and we'll try and get back to them. But we will see you in September for next season. Thanks for joining us this season, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.